Are 20-mile-an-hour speed limits anti-motorist? Does Labour want to reopen Brexit? And should we listen to Liz Truss? This is Politics Live. With me today, the Conservative MP Laura Farris, Shadow Defence Minister Luke Pollard, Daily Telegraph columnist Madeleine Grant and Guardian columnist Raphael Behr. Today, look who's back.
The policies I advocate simply are not fashionable on the London dinner party circuit.
Was Liz Truss actually right about the economy? Keir Starmer says he'll renegotiate Britain's Brexit deal, so will Labour align us with the EU? Wales reduces the speed limit to 20 miles per hour in built-up areas. Is that unfair to motorists?
This is absolutely insane, even by the standards of the Labour's Welsh government.
Hello, well, we're going to talk a lot more about that speech from Liz Truss this morning, but we are going to start with this headline from the Daily Telegraph. Labour trying to block Liz Truss's honours list. Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Paymaster General, has written to Rishi Sunak urging him to stop his predecessor's plans. So, Luke, if I can come to you, why shouldn't Liz Truss have an honours list?
Well, Liz Truss crashed the economy. She caused untold damage and pain for nearly every single household in the country, with increased rent and increased mortgage costs. Her 47 days should not justify a resignation honours list, especially if it's likely to be Tory donors, those people that stuffed the Liz Truss for Leader campaign with cash, who are going to be rewarded after her disastrous and reckless time in office. Rishi Sunak should block the honours list, but I fear he'll be too weak to do so and too weak to stand up to his own party in doing that. But this is simply, honours should be there to celebrate the very best of our country, not the very worst times in our politics.
OK, Laura, what do you think?
Well, actually, I agree with the last sentence that Luke said. I think honours should reward the best of our country. And standing back from it, I think there is an issue with the size and the composition of the House of Lords, and I've said as much more than once on the floor of the House of Commons. But we have a convention where outgoing prime ministers, whether you like them or you dislike them, are allowed to nominate peers. I don't know who she's nominated, and I think, anyway, that it's with the House of Lords Appointments Commission. They are the ones, actually, who have the verification responsibility. So I think sort of trying to politicise it and saying Rishi should block it, that isn't realistic because it's not how it works. But do I think that there is an argument for reform of the House of Lords? Yes, I do.
But he could block it if he wanted to.
But that has never happened at any point in our history.
So it is a choice that he could make to block it, to say, you crashed the economy, you caused all this pain for people in Britain, therefore you're not going to get this honours list for your 47 days of chaos. That is a choice he could make. It
isn't a choice he could make. It's a choice, actually, that Liz Truss could have made about her own decision about how she did or didn't choose to reward people who she'd worked with.
Self-awareness is not one of Liz's strengths, though, is it?
OK, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Madeleine, what do you think? We understand there are 14 people on the honours list. It is with the House of Lords at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think the thing to be most fussed about is the life peers, because unlike the gongs, which don't really cost anything, this guarantees, the life ability to come to assist with making legislation, to claim a lot of money every day that you're in the House of Lords. And I think Laura's quite right. It has ballooned out of control. Really, it requires, I think, some party consensus about limiting the numbers. Perhaps there should be rules now where, you have to reach a certain limit of time in office before you're allowed to nominate a resignation list. However, I would say that it is a bit tricky to go about it in this way of shooting down the list now, because, of course, it lays the precedent that in the future other politicians might attempt to do this to Labour in the future and shoot down their honours list. Essentially, as with so much in our constitution, it kind of relies on convention and people choosing to do the right thing. But obviously, recent resignation decisions have really tested the limit of that convention.
Yeah, because it is not that normal for us to have a Prime Minister for 49
Precisely.
days, is it? Raphael?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And Laura got to the heart of the tension here, which is there is, on the one hand, a convention that people follow, that Prime Ministers get this entitlement to put people, their friends, their donors, their supporters, or whoever they like, in the upper legislature of the parliament. I mean, that in itself is constitutionally a bit bizarre and insane, but we can park that. And then you have the practical question of whether this particular individual did a good enough job of public service that they should want to take that entitlement. And so, my sense is, I think we've tested to destruction the idea that a natural sense of honour and propriety and what the right thing ought to be can govern these decisions. I think you just need to reform the process more fundamentally.
Time for an actual introduction of an actual limit, perhaps. OK, well, we said we were going to talk more about her speech this morning. Let's listen now to a little bit more of what Liz Truss had to say.
We also need to reduce marginal tax rates to make it worthwhile to work at every income level. Further changes like abolishing the tourist tax, abolishing the windfall tax, and sorting out IR35 need to be made. We also need to get a grip on the ballooning welfare and pensions bill. This means slowing the rates of increase to benefits and tougher work requirements. It means raising the retirement age further. And as a party, we have to deal with the difficult issue of the increasing cost of pensions. The current trajectory is not sustainable.
That was Liz Truss, a little excerpt of her speech from this morning. I'd like to introduce now Julian Jessup, who's joining us from the free market think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs, and a big supporter of Liz Truss, I think it'd be fair to say. Julian, why should we still be listening to anything Liz Truss has to say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to correct something that was said earlier. Liz Truss didn't crash the economy. Indeed, the economy itself didn't crash at all. There was undoubtedly a big increase in interest rates, both mortgage rates and also the cost of government borrowing. But the mini-budget was only a very small part of that. Interest rates were rising around the world. Indeed, other countries, particularly the US, have seen very sharp increases in interest rates over this period as well. So I think Liz Truss and Trussonomics more generally was a convenient scapegoat for something that would have happened anyway. In terms of what she got wrong, I think she's acknowledged mistakes around communication in particular and underestimating the nervousness in the markets and the hostility of much of the establishment. But I also think that she got a lot right. Above all, the importance of economic growth. I mean, we need more economic growth if we're going to get the tax revenues in that we need to fund vital public services. And indeed, even the Labour Party, I think, has now acknowledged that. They're talking about delivering the highest sustained growth in the G7 group of advanced economies. So she has moved the dial, and I think we should continue to listen to her about the best way to deliver that stronger growth. OK,
well, you want to listen to her, but can I play you now a clip from Mark Carney, the former Governor of the Bank of England, over the weekend with his verdict on her premiership?
When Brexiteers tried to create Singapore on the Thames, the Truss government instead delivered Argentina on the Channel. Those didn't feel so good, and that was a year ago.
Argentina on the Channel. It was pretty damning, isn't it?
Well, I'm afraid Mark Carney's got form here. He's done a number of dodgy comparisons, particularly in the context of Brexit, false comparisons between what's happened to the UK economy and the German economy in particular. So I wouldn't pay an enormous amount of attention to what he's saying. It is fair to say that the increased political uncertainty over the last few years, the constant chopping and changing of prime ministers and chancellors has dented international investor confidence in the UK. But I think it's a bit odd to be still blaming Liz Truss for that now, when she's been out of power for quite a while and the so-called grown-ups are back in charge.
Yeah, is there not a problem that she's somewhat rewriting history here, because she's essentially advocating about kind of spending less, smaller government? If you actually look at what she did, one of the first things she did was introduce the energy price guarantee for 2 years, which would, if it had gone on for 2 years, could have cost in excess of £100 billion, and then was also advocating for tax cuts. So she wasn't really talking about spending less, was she, when she was in the job?
Well, to be clear, I wouldn't have supported everything that she was proposing. And indeed, you mentioned my affiliation with the Institute of Economic Affairs. The IEA was actually quite critical of large parts of what she was doing, particularly the energy price guarantee, but also announcing tax cuts before you'd announced spending restraint alongside that. But her point
But that was her undoing, wasn't it? It was the fact that she did those things that was the problem.
Well, ironically, I think that her undoing was something that she actually got right. She'd been warning for a number of years that interest rates were far too low and needed to rise sharply at some point. What she wanted to do was to put in place policies to offset the impact of that on the economy. The problem was that she wasn't able to deliver that for various reasons, resistance from the establishment, even within her own party, which meant that she didn't have the opportunity to deliver the spending restraint that would have offset the impact of the tax cuts on the public finances.
OK, Luke, I mean, you were slightly frowning there at some of the things that Julian had to say. Do you want to come in?
Well, I think there's very few people who really think that what our politics needs at the moment is more Liz Truss. I think what we do need to make sure is that we are learning the lessons from an appalling part of our political history that did crash the economy, that did cause enormous pain for people, and that pain's continuing. The only thing I wanted to hear from her today was her apologising for her decisions, and she has refused to do that. It's this self-delusion, this self-justification that we're hearing from Liz Truss and some of her supporters that, as you said, were trying to rewrite history, trying to pretend that the economy didn't crash based on their decisions, pretending that their instructions that they wanted to go even further, that caused even more economic damage to Britain, was somehow just something that we can forget, something that didn't really happen. Don't you worry about it. It's real because people are paying more in rent, more in mortgages, and there's more instability, lower growth, directly because of the decisions that Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng and the Tory government took a year ago. The best thing that Liz Truss could do now is apologise and then spend time out of the public eye, I think.
Laura.
Well, I disagree with something Julian said. I don't think that public expenditure can be brought under control in an inflationary environment, and I don't think that you dampen inflation and demand through tax cuts and loosening fiscal policy, and I don't think that fiscal responsibility is antithetical to growth. So let me just say those things. And those were things that had been tried previously by Anthony Barber in the 1970s with a similar impact. And the Prime Minister has always said that tackling inflation, something he's making very reasonable progress with, despite how difficult it is, was his number one priority. And he staked his entire leadership campaign on it. In fact, he was willing to lose over delivering some hard truths on that. And even though I know Luke won't say it, I think the Labour Party agree that it was right to try and tackle inflation. If I could just come back to some of the things I think Liz wanted to say. And I was a bit disappointed she didn't say it in her speech today, because there has been some really important progress on things that she advocated or at least hinted at when in her very short tenure as Prime Minister. One of them is childcare, and I've been a vocal backbencher on this issue. The 4.5 billion childcare investment is the biggest in its history, 30 free hours for families of children from 9 months older. I mean, that would have changed my life when I was the mum of young kids. And the IMF has said that that should boost growth in the medium term. The IMF has also said that we're looking to have the faster growth in Italy and France and Germany over the next 5 years. So through these really difficult economic circumstances, everything the government's doing is moving in that direction. And I think that the way that Rishi's led really deserves support.
Julian, do you want to come back to any of those points? Because
Well,
there are those who would advocate the free market economy, who would say that this huge amount of spending that's being thrown towards childcare is not necessarily a good thing. That's expanding the state further.
Well, 2 points there. I mean, first of all, the tax cuts that Liz Truss was talking about, or rather the cancellation of tax increases, weren't necessarily going to feed into a big increase in demand. They're mainly about what we call the supply side of the economy. So, for example, the fact that we've now had that big increase in corporation tax and the windfall tax on energy companies on top of that is damaging the supply side performance. The economy, it's holding back investment, and that is actually going to contribute to higher inflation than we would otherwise have had. In terms of the other measures, I mean, there are a number of things that Liz Truss proposed that either have been abandoned completely or significantly watered down. So, big things on liberalising planning to make it easier to build the housing and the other infrastructure that we need. So it wasn't just about pouring more money into the economy. Quite the opposite. It was about targeted measures that make the economy perform better through market-led reforms and dealing with the supply side problems.
Madeline, should we still listen to Liz Truss?
Well, I think we could find someone to make similar arguments that I agree with Julian about, for example, growth being important. But clearly there are better figureheads than Liz
Everyone
Truss
agrees on
to
growth
be
being
making.
important,
Well,
don't they?
I'm not sure. It hasn't been valued across the political spectrum for a very long time, and we still haven't tackled things like why it's so impossible to build almost anything in this country, and all of things you could do without even spending money to make the economy more prosperous. And Liz Truss was banging that drum, but she was not the only person who did it. And it's interesting. She basically spoke in the language, the rhetoric of Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, but notably, Thatcherites, some of the luminaries of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, such as Nigel Lawson, Ken Clarke, were not refusing to endorse her precisely on the basis that she was proposing to do all these tax cuts unfunded and was proposing to spend more and enlarge the size of the state without taking the fiscal restraint. So she was trying to have the kudos of the tax cuts without the difficulty and the fiscal restraint necessary to bring them about in a sensible way.
Raphael.
That's a key point. I mean, first of all, it is true that wanting growth is a sort of truism. It's a banal thing to say about the economy right now. There is clearly absolute consensus across Westminster, across politics, that the economy should grow more. In terms of what the actual obstruction to Liz Truss's plan working was, the suggestion that there was somehow a political or a cultural establishment that got in the way. It was the market that bucked it. And this is where Luke's point about rewriting history is so important. The reason Liz Truss politically failed, the roots of that actually go right back to the summer when she was doing the leadership contest. First of all, she started sort of hinting that maybe you should compromise the Bank of England's independence. As soon as she got in, one of the first things that happened is she dismissed, or Kwasi Kwarteng dismissed Tom Scholar from the Treasury, signalling, well, we don't really like Treasury orthodoxy, we don't like, the sort of the way things have been done up till now. They do the mini budget with essentially unfunded tax cuts. When there's a bit of a market jitter, Kwasi Kwarteng goes on television that Sunday and says, there's more to come. We've barely even started. So it was the market that sort of tried to swallow this and sort of regurgitated it because it was essentially such fundamentally sort of irresponsible fiscal policy.
Julian, do you want to come back there?
Well, I partly agree with that. I mean, clearly the Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng administration underestimated two related things. One is the nervousness in the markets at the time, and they were warned about that by some outside advisors. But they also underestimated the hostility of much of the political and economic establishment, including a lot of the media, and those sort of things fed into each other. So it's very easy to see why international investors took fright when prominent figures in the UK were talking about us heading the way of Turkey or maybe I should now say Argentina. So I think there was a problem of communication there, and also timing. If we take, for example, the abolition of the 45p upper rate of income tax. I think that's a perfectly sensible supply-side measure, but it fed into this narrative of the government moving too far too quickly. The political optics were bad, and then combined with Kwasi Kwarteng doubling down over the weekend, saying you ain't seen nothing yet, or words to that effect. That undoubtedly made the problem worse than it would otherwise have been.
Okay,
can I just add a tiny thing? Something else Liz Truss has said today in her speech that has been picked up less. She herself acknowledged that the Conservative Party, the Parliamentary Conservative Party, would have struggled to sort of take on the spending cuts that would have been required by her own fiscal policy. She recognises that actually what the UK wants in terms of the delivery of public services, in terms of expectations for the health service, when you think about the state of crumbling schools, the actual fiscal idea that she had presented would not have been deliverable without cuts to the public sector that the UK public and Tory MPs wouldn't even be able to tolerate.
Laura, you are a Tory MP.
Look, I think it is of course, there are really, these conversations happen all the time between the backbench and the front bench about how we could reduce the amount of public spending. And I think there are lots of sort of sensible ideas in circulation. It is true that the demands on public spending are really high, and some of that is the sort of hangover, I think, from COVID. First there was the furlough scheme, but there's been the very large energy packages and so on. But I don't think that that's what caused the collapse of Liz Truss, that there was sort of irreconcilable issues, and I don't even recall those conversations happening at the time. And I suppose the only sort of final point that I would make, just on the strength of what she was saying today, it is the fact that she did sack her Chancellor and reverse most of her policies while she was still in Number 10. So,
is there an appetite
it was a concession to...
Because essentially what Liz Truss was saying today was that there isn't really an appetite for what she was advocating within the current Conservative Party.
Of course there is an appetite, but there is the absolute absolute imperative to grip inflation as a priority, and that necessitates certain very difficult and unappetising realities in order to drive it down, so that, you know, when I go around my constituency, it doesn't matter whether I am talking to somebody about wages or a school about the pressure on school budgets. Every single problem can be tracked back to inflation, and until we get a grip on that, then there is, you know, the problems will be manifest and will continue to multiply.
OK, all right, we are going to leave that one there and say thank you very much to Julian Jessup from the IEA. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Right, we are going to move on now and talk a little bit about Brexit. We're going to start with this headline from the Financial Times just this morning. Keir Starmer pledges to seek a major rewrite of the Brexit deal. So Keir Starmer said he wants a much better deal with the EU if Labour wins the next general election. He told the Financial Times in that article that the current deal, which is due for review in 2025, is too thin. But he has ruled out rejoining the customs union or the single market. Luke, what will closer alignment with the EU mean? What does he mean? What's he talking about?
Well, what Keir's setting out is that the current Brexit deal that we have is not working. It's not working for people who export or for people who import. Indeed, the Prime Minister himself has amended the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated with the Windsor Framework and by rejoining Horizon and Copernicus. So there's already been changes to a Brexit deal that clearly is not working. The kind of examples that Keir's looking at are things like having a veterinary agreement with the European Union, which means that you remove the paperwork and the checks at the border for food importers. And for a constituency like mine in the southwest, where we export fish and food and farm produce to our friends in the European Union, the massive explosion and the cost of bureaucracy is really bad. Now, if New Zealand can have a veterinary agreement with the European Union and still maintain independent standards, so can the United Kingdom.
So what's the trade-off for that then? What do we have to give the EU? We're going to have to be more closely aligned, essentially.
Well, that's part of a negotiation when it comes to 2025, which is already built into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. There will be a review in 2025 as to how it is working. And what Keir is setting out is that there's large parts of Boris Johnson's Brexit agreement that is not working. It's not working for exporters and importers. It's not working for our economy. And when growth that we've just been talking about is so low, this added bureaucracy and added costs that have come from this botched Brexit deal is something that Keir's saying, look, we can look again at elements of this in a sensible discussion with our friends in the EU to make it work. Because if we don't make Brexit work, we're not going to get the growth that we need in our economy, and we're going to continue to put pressure on businesses like fishing businesses in my patch that have given up exporting to the EU because it's now too expensive and have settled for smaller businesses because the paperwork and the cost could put them out of business.
So one of the things that's mentioned is youth mobility. So that means you are open potentially to more visas for workers, more visas for students. That's on the table.
Well, that's not one of the things that Keir himself has been talking about.
He mentioned youth mobility.
What we need to get at is, as a whole, when it comes to 2025, to look again at what is working and what is not. Keir's been very clear that it's about improving our trading relationship. This is not about going back into the single market or the customs union. He's been very clear that that's not on the cards. But it is about making a deal that works better. And I think if every party were to be honest with themselves, they know that the Brexit deal that was signed is not good enough for our country. And when it comes to this review point, there will need to be improvements being made. The Prime Minister's already said so by improving the Brexit deal in the Windsor Framework. What Keir's setting out is very clearly that the next Labour government wants to focus that on trade and improving our trading relationship, and that will be good for British businesses.
Laura.
I think that what's being suggested is retrospective and unrealistic. There is no opportunity to reopen a trading relationship without having to make major concessions to the EU. I think the reality is that a reasonable third-party agreement was concluded that left two gaping holes. One was Northern Ireland, and the other one, I think, was the associate membership of the United Kingdom in the Horizon scheme. Both of those have been resolved by the Prime Minister. And what you've seen, actually, particularly with the conclusion of the Windsor Framework, is a complete resetting of that relationship. You will have, everybody saw the language between him and Ursula von der Leyen when they announced that. It isn't realistic to say that you can reopen without us having to make major concessions to the EU. Luke talked about food and veterinary products, and I think it is well recognised that there is room to finesse that type of arrangement. The trusted trader scheme that's been talked about in Northern Ireland, but that is a matter of a smoother existing trade arrangement.
Which is
The language that Keir is talking about is a rewrite that either doesn't exist or it involves taking us back into the EU.
Well, that's not true. I mean, it's really important to say this because there will be voices, and you're normally a very sensible voice on this, that will say Labour's thing will take us back into the single market and customs union. That is not what Keir is saying. In fact, he is nearly blue in the face about how many times he says that.
But it is about improving the elements. It is a fantasy to suggest that the European Union is there waiting to renegotiate the Brexit deal with us. I don't think anybody thinks that's realistic. What exists in 2025 is an opportunity to see, for example, if new technologies exist that could reduce the friction that exists. And you've talked about veterinary products. Everybody in Parliament knows that that is something that could be improved. But it's not an opportunity to renegotiate or rewrite in the way that is being suggested.
OK. Raphael, what is interesting here is that the perception, at least, was that voters at the last election, the idea that Labour would take us back into the single market or the customs union was a real turn-off for them. Is this a smart move by Keir Starmer now?
Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons that the suggestion that Labour might get too close to the European Union was deemed politically toxic is because certainly rejoining the single market entails freedom of movement, and that opens a whole argument about immigration, open-door immigration, that Labour very obviously definitely doesn't want to have in certain constituencies. What's interesting in what Luke just said, I think, is the sense that if you point out that Rishi Sunak has rejoined Horizon, there have been compromises on the retained law bill, there have been compromises on having a distinct UK sort of kite mark thing, because that ultimately alignment ends up having to work across all sorts of sectors anyway. There's a sort of recognition that actually, although he won't say it, the current Prime Minister understands that introducing massive friction in trade with the huge single market on your doorstep is bad for the economy, and that continues to be bad for the economy, and that continues to be a slow puncture, and therefore you want to fix that. And here's where Laura's right, unfortunately, and this is why that exchange you just saw so perfectly demonstrates what a horrendous impasse we are in, because Laura's point about actually to get to serious changes that would substantially eliminate that friction, you're talking about major concessions, you're talking about a very different institutional relationship with the European Union.
Yeah.
But if you rule out the single market and the customs union for very good political reasons, there isn't very much in between. So it does feel, I'm afraid to say, it feels like we are quite stuck between those two positions, both of which are sort of valid from their own political perspectives, but neither of which actually resolves the economic problem we have in our utterly dysfunctional now relationship with the EU.
Well, I think it's this issue has been covered very well by by Raphael and Laura. I think that either this is it's being billed as if this were going to be some kind of major changes made, which doesn't stack up to what even very well-connected people in the EU are saying. There was an update today from Wolfgang Munkau, who is an economist and knows a lot about these issues and is well-connected in EU circles, saying precisely this, that without a customs union single market, there will be no major concessions, in which case all the briefing around this, I suspect, may be let up to a disappointment, because it will turn that actually the levers that are available to pull don't amount to anything substantial.
Yeah, I mean, is there actually an appetite for it? I'm just hearing that my colleague Jess Parker has been speaking to an EU diplomat this morning who said they don't see why it would be necessary to have any major renegotiation, and that the EU thinks there are bigger fish to fry.
Well, there's already a negotiation, a review in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in 2025.
The EU will say, all right, yeah, thanks, but no thanks.
That is where the relationship with the European Union does matter. For the past few years, we've had a series of Conservative politicians who are quite happy burning the relationship, throwing insults and trashing that constructive relationship.
That's not true of Rishi Sunak, though.
But that is where we have been over the past few years. I think you can probably agree.
Yeah,
and what Labour has set out...
Rishi Sunak has taken some steps to
remedy
that.
And then the underlying point that it was strategically, everything that happened 2016 to 2019 was a strategic cul-de-sac for the UK. That is the tacit point that Rishi Sunak has acknowledged, and he just doesn't have the political capital to take it to the next stage.
Madeline, do you want to carry on your...
Well, I mean, my point was simply that, this idea that you can extract more concessions just by kind of being nicer to the EU, I mean, that's already been the policy of this government.
Being nicer.
Being nicer.
Be nicer
like good vibes,
yeah.
It's sort of vibes-based. And the idea that you're going to get anything significant by continuing that policy without offering some concessions in return is just cloud cuckoo land.
There is a way, I think, that involves conceiving of an entirely new, unprecedented institutional arrangement with the European Union, and it could work around looking about what Ukraine's future relationship with the European Union will be, what other expansion to sort of Southeast Europe might be. But that's a 10-year project. You're talking about totally reimagining a different rung on the ladder that the UK could climb back up to get out of the strategic hole it's dug itself. But that's not going to happen between now and the next election.
OK, well, thinking about trade-offs and what we might need to do to have kind of better relations with the EU, of course, there was another story related to this last week in relation to migrants and illegal migration on small boats. We can have a look at this headline from The Guardian this morning. Labour will not say how many migrants it would accept in EU returns deal. Keir Starmer dismisses Tory claims of a plan to oversee 100,000 extra arrivals as complete garbage. Complete garbage, Luke, but it's somewhat of a bit of a PR disaster, the announcement of this policy, isn't it?
No, I think Keir's exactly right. It is complete garbage. You've got a government simply making things up to satisfy their base on this. The current small boats situation is not working. The small boats have not been stopped in the year that Rishi Sunak has been Prime Minister. In fact, we've seen tens of thousands of people coming. We're not seeing the action to speed up processing. We're seeing gimmicks like sending people to Rwanda costing £140 million. We've only sent one person to Rwanda. That's the Home Secretary on a PR jolly. What we need to have is speeding up of processing to clear the backlog and clear immigration hotels. We need to have a dedicated police unit looking at this. And I think Keir making the case that those criminal gangs that profit from the human misery of the small boat scandal should be treated in the same way as terrorists, as serious, shows the determination that the next Labour government has to get on top of this, because the small boats are not being stopped by the Conservatives. Let's be absolutely clear about this. And no matter how many times the Prime Minister says he is, they're still coming. And that's why we need a completely different approach. And that's what Labour is setting out.
OK, I'm going to come in on that. I used to practice in this area of the law before I became an MP. It is a fantasy to say that there was a functional returns agreement that existed with the EU before Brexit. The Dublin regulation didn't work, and there was the idea of catching the criminal gangs is very much like saying we're going to crack down on drug barons. Of course, if you could do it, it would be a highly effective policy, but it's almost impossible given the peripatetic nature of the business, the fact that there is no coordinating enterprise, they can fragment, and all of this was a sort of feature of my life before becoming an MP. It is also, I have to say, a fallacy to say that speeding up processing would do anything other than just increase the number of people coming through the bottleneck. The only way that you can stop the illegal route across the Channel is to create a complete deterrent, which means they will not have the right to remain now or ever, and they will be kept safe in accordance with our obligations under the Refugee and Human Rights Convention in a third-party state. Actually, that originated as Labour policy under David Blunkett in a slightly different context in 2002. But just coming on to what has actually happened, even the fact of the Albanian returns agreement has seen a 90% fall in the Albanians making the small boat crossings. Small boat arrivals are down 20%, even though there's been an explosion of people coming into Europe over the same time period, 2023. And the final point is, it's impossible to say conclusively what the position is on Rwanda, because the Supreme Court will decide that when they hear the case on the 9th of October. And in fact, all politicians who come in and talk one way or the other about Rwanda have got to concede that that is now in the hands of our most senior members of the judiciary.
Do you want to come back there?
Well, I think this is going to continue to run and run. But one of Rishi's key pledges that he wanted to be judged by is that he will stop the small boats. He is not stopping the small boats. There's been marginal changes, but it's not happening. And right in between now, run up to the election, what we as a party need to make clear is that we've got a different plan to the government, one that targets criminal gangs, one that deals with the backlogs. I don't agree that having people waiting in asylum hotels for years is the right solution to this. It's harming community cohesion, it's harming communities, and it's doing nothing for those people waiting in hotels.
About Rwanda. First of all, there is no evidence at all that having a stricter policy in your domestic labour market has a deterrent effect on people coming to the country. But it's possible that if you get really harsh, really strict enough, that will happen. But with the Rwanda policy, let's say the Supreme Court judgment goes in the government's favour and you can start actually deporting people to Rwanda. The capacity at the maximum estimate is going to be about 300 people over 5 to 10 years, right? And so, meanwhile, you have thousands of people crossing. Now, the illegal migration bill gives the government, gives the Home Secretary an obligation to detain everyone who comes over illegally and absolutely automatically remove their right to asylum. So the question then is that the government will be obliged to intern and detain thousands of people. Where are they going to go? What is the policy going to be of essentially imprisoning asylum seekers, possibly in their tens of thousands for the next decade?
If I could just come back very gently on 3 points. If the Supreme Court finds in the government's favour on Rwanda, then I think the government has intimated that there are other countries with whom third-party deals could be reached. The other point is that if the Rwanda scheme becomes operational, the point is not to be sending tens of thousands of people to Rwanda. It is to see, hopefully, a radical drop in the number making the journey in the first place because there's no incentive. And Raphael, if I might just make one final point. Lord Brown, the cross-party retired Supreme Court Justice, he's recently died. He spoke in the debate in the Lords. He was a public lawyer before he became a Supreme Court Justice. And I really encourage you to read his speech in Hansard. And he said that he believed that some system of only allowing the claim for asylum to be made in a third-party country was the only way we would stop the small boats.
OK, thanks all. We're going to move on now in the last 10 minutes of the programme and talk about speed limits. Motorists in Wales are going a little more slowly than they were in the past after the introduction of a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in all built-up areas. Let's have a look at this headline from North Wales Live. Welsh drivers react on day one of Wales' 20-mile-per-hour speed limit as one tells of worst experience. And joining us now, I'm very pleased to say, is the Deputy Minister for Climate Change in Wales in the Senedd, Lee Waters. Hello, good morning to you, Lee.
Hi.
Not good morning. We're in the afternoon, aren't we? Good afternoon.
I didn't like to say. I thought it was peppy.
Thank you for not correcting me. Right. 61% of people in Wales opposed to this change in a recent poll. Why on earth is the Welsh Government doing this?
Well, the evidence is very clear. This will save lives, it'll reduce casualties, and it'll improve the quality of life in communities. The polls have been up and down on it, as you might expect, and it's the first full day it's come in. This will take a good while to get used to. We've tested this in 8 different Welsh communities and found after about 4 or 5 weeks in most places, it calms down and people get used to it. And it's a big change. It will take time to get used to.
And there's been quite a big backlash. I mean, we're told that the change will cost the economy as much as 4.5 billion. It's a price worth paying.
Well, if you want to go into that, this is a Treasury formula that tries to put a financial value on things, and some things you simply can't put a financial value on. What is the value of a family being spared the grief of a dead child, for example? They try and put value on journey time savings to the economy. This will have, according to our estimates, the average impact of 1 minute per car journey. So they then add up every single car journey and they'll multiply by 30 years and they come up with this £4.5 billion figure. But if I'm a minute late because it's a dentist or 2 minutes late to go and see my mother, that's not going to harm the economy, is it? So for sure, there'll be some impact on just-in-time delivery businesses, and the business model will have to adjust, and you set that against the big savings to society. 2,000 fewer casualties every year, 10 lives saved, and a saving to the NHS of near 100 million from the absence of deaths and the walking wounded going into hospitals.
OK, Madeline, 2,000 fewer casualties.
Well, I mean, you could drive at 5 miles an hour and have even fewer. I mean, you do. These trade-offs are, it sounds a bit macabre, but you do have to draw the line somewhere. And I think that this is quite an extraordinary piece of legislation. It's not just affecting, I don't think anyone would have a problem with driving slowly if you're going past a primary school or through a village, but this affects vast swathes of Welsh road, and it's estimated to cost £33 million just to establish the scheme, and then will cost the economy in the years that follow £9 billion. And Wales is already seeing fewer tourists than in previous years, and the economy is not in the best state as things currently stand. So this is just needlessly, I think, an act of self-harm. And along with things like the lieu scheme, it does feed into a broader sense that although these are devolved decisions, that they suggest a tendency towards, ignoring the plight of people who are trying to make a living, people who have to travel by car for work, that Labour is ultimately not on the side of working people when it comes to these sorts of decisions.
Lee, do you want to respond to that? I mean, it's true to say, isn't it, that in Wales, like much of the rest of the United Kingdom, the car is absolutely invaluable to most people because public transport isn't really there to support them.
Well, if I was playing Tory Central Office bingo, Madeline has ticked off every single one of the talking points there. Well done, Madeline. This is coming in London.
This is genuinely what I think and what a lot of people think.
Yeah, identical to the Tory talking points, uncanny. It's coming in London with a 20% fall in casualties. It's coming in Scotland, in Edinburgh, with a 20% fall in casualties. It's the default speed limit in Spain, where there's a 20% fall in casualties. This only applies in built-up areas. We're taking the lead from the UN Declaration, the Stockholm Declaration on Road Safety, which says in built-up areas where people and traffic mix, 20 mile an hour is a suitable speed. That's why we're doing it, and the evidence is robust that it's effective. And Conservative Cornwall are in the process of doing the same thing.
OK, Laura.
I thought that was a really patronising answer, and I think that's really consistent with the way that the policy's been introduced. I'm amazed that the Welsh Labour government feel they can waste their time on something. Madeleine made the point, if all cars drove at 0 miles an hour, you'd have 0 accidents and you'd save a family a tragedy, of course. But 20 miles an hour is the speed of a fast bike. And, if you look at the data, you look at a car driving at 30 miles per hour, there's about less than a 5% chance that a collision will lead to a fatality. But that increases by 5 times if you get to 40 miles per hour. The way that speed limits have been worked out and have become very common on our roads has been really careful and has looked at fatalities. And this is just a sort of impediment to drivers that, in terms of normal driving, overreaction on safety, the timing getting to work. I mean, I'm not massively exercised about this. I just find it derisory and embarrassing that Labour government wasted time on stuff like this.
Just one point quickly. I mean, I oppose this measure, obviously. I'm not speaking from the CCHQ press release. I genuinely believe that. So does Keir Starmer. He does not support this. Otherwise, he would be bringing it in himself. So is he also reading from CCHQ script?
Lee.
Well, I haven't heard him say any of those things. The point about this being only applying outside schools, that 80% of injuries of children don't apply outside schools. They occur on people playing outside the house on the journey to school. That's why we've taken 4 years to do this, working with some of the leading experts, looking at the international evidence, trialling it in Welsh communities. This is not something we've done flippantly, and the evidence is robust. Slower speeds save lives. By the time a car travelling at 20 comes to a stop, a car travelling at 30 is still travelling at 24 mile an hour. And if you were hit at 20 mile an hour, you are 5 times more likely to die than you are at 30 mile an hour. I understand that laissez-faire attitudes are the theme of the day in the modern Conservative Party. But when it comes to people's lives and children's lives, I'm not sure we can be so cavalier.
Not cavalier. So, Luke, we should be rolling this out across the rest of the United Kingdom.
This is where devolution allows different parts of the United Kingdom to make different decisions. I believe in devolution, and the next Labour government said we want to devolve more powers to areas. Now,
But do you believe in 20 mile an hour speed limits?
I do, and I've campaigned for 20 mile an hour speed limits in Plymouth, and I've had a Labour council and Conservative councils back that. Indeed, the current Tory government encourages councils to introduce 20 mile an hour zones as well. So look, this is about having people having the powers to make the decisions. I think powers are best used and decisions best made when they're made closer to communities. That's what councils in England are doing. That's what the Welsh government is doing. And that's where we can have the opportunity to save lives, because cars going slower does make a difference. I know that in...
So it's such a good idea, it should be rolled out across England?
No, in England, what we have said is Labour does not want a default 20 mile an hour zone in urban areas. We want councils to make the decision based on what's best for their area. So that you don't get blamed for it. Raphael? No, because that's the right decision, Elizabeth. That's the right decision in England. But Welsh government has taken a different decision in Wales.
I very recently had to do the driver speed awareness course. Do you remember the one that Suella Braverman didn't really fancy doing? Because my offence was having not seen the sign doing about 25 in a 20 zone. And anyone who's done that course, you are presented with the evidence. And yes, Madeleine's absolutely right. You have to draw the line somewhere. Clearly, 0 miles an hour, 0 fatalities, 100 miles an hour, extremely dangerous. But actually, it's not a straight line. As Laura said, the graph moves exponentially, and there is a very significant difference between 20 and 30. And you are making a calculation about the increment, and it's a trade-off, as you say, between a motorist's right to go a bit faster and a parent's right to feel a bit more confident about their children being near the road. It seems to me, throw in a bit of devolution, see if it works in Wales. I'm happy to see what happens.
Final quick word, Lee. Couple of seconds.
Well, this is the first time it's been done on a national basis. Scotland and Ireland have said they want to follow. Let's see what the evidence is like. If the same happens in Wales as has happened elsewhere, we will save lives. The world will not come to an end. It's a big change, just as seatbelts was a big change, and we will quickly adapt to it.
Thank you, Lee Waters. Thanks very much for joining us. That is all we have time for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.